As a way of introduction to Matthew Phillips is a senior water engineer that is currently employed by Arup. He has over 9 years of experience, with his key experience including urban water management, water strategy development, stormwater design and management, hydraulic and floodline analysis, river rehabilitation, climate change impact assessments. He has also worked in areas such as Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, Zambia, and the Philippines. He is also a certified water sensitive cities benchmarker. Matthew, if you are ready to start with your presentation, you may take it from here.
Marvel, can you just confirm that you can see my slide?
Yeah, we can, Matthew, and your sound is good.
Perfect. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Thank you all for joining. So as Karabo said, my name is Matthew Phillips. I work for Arup. I'll be speaking about the African sponge. So it's a bit of a play on words later on in the presentation. Ja, thanks for taking your time out today and evening to join in on this session. I was told that it was a student series, but I see there are quite a few people that aren't necessarily students. So what I've done is I thought I'd just prepare a slide on just a brief introduction about myself, to say where I've come from. I studied civil engineering in 2013, finished the UKZN, stayed in Durban in 2014, moved to Cape Town towards the end of 2014 until 2020, worked mainly in the water and flooding space, like Karabo had mentioned, then came back to Durban for family reasons at the end of 2020, got my PRN 2022, and I'm actually on day 2 of doing my master's in waste and resource management at UKZN. I'm doing that part-time while working for Arup. As on the right-hand side, there's just some countries that I've traveled to because of work, and then also some countries that I've worked remotely, done projects remotely. So what is a sponge city? So it comes from Prof. Yu Kongjian, who's a professor in China, and he coined the phrase of a sponge city based on his childhood experience when he was on their family farm, and the edge of the farm bordered a river, and during a flood he went to go and look at the river, stood on the river bank, the bank gave way and he fell into the river. Because the area was quite undeveloped and had a lot of natural vegetation, he was fortunately able to grab hold of the vegetation on the banks of the river and pull himself out. And from that point on, I guess, as he went through life, he realized that the vegetation, nature, and that actually helped him and saved his life, as cliche as that is, but it's trying to really incorporate nature within design, within engineering, to mitigate the impacts of flooding. And that's looking at things of like, don't fight the water, so allow it to happen. I think conventionally we would design stormwater and flood type of measures to try and get rid of water as quickly as possible. But the sponge city concept is not to actually do that, it's rather to, let's say, embrace it from the source, so where it comes from, the flow, how it maneuvers through the system, and then the sink, which would be where it ends up. At Arup, we saw early last year, towards the end of 2021, that there was potential to try and do sponge city snapshots for different cities across the world. What this does is, because it's a snapshot, it's a call it a snapshot of a point in time of a city and how spongy they are. How we determine the sponginess is we determine the mixture of the blue, green, and grey infrastructure percentage, which is the blue infrastructure is your rivers, your watercourses, your dams, your lakes. Add that with your soil types and vegetation, so that's like your infiltration abilities, and then add a specific rainfall event. Combine those 3 together, and that tells you how spongy a city is, or what's its ability to absorb the rainfall that it receives. we take a 150 square kilometer snapshot or area to do this analysis, and it's city's ability to absorb its own rainfall. How we determine the different things specifically on the sorry, let me go back one. On the blue, green, and gray infrastructure, that is based on aerial imagery. We have a machine learning tool called Terrain, which I'll speak about in the next slide. As machine learning identifies the different land use, and that identifies the different blue, green, and gray infrastructure based on that aerial or satellite imagery for that 150 square kilometer area. The soil types and vegetation is a globally available data sets that we use to determine those infiltration and interception capabilities. And then the rainfall is what we do is we take a 50 millimeter rainfall for a day, and we throw that onto the soil and the blue, green, gray infrastructure to determine its sponginess. Understand that this is an initial assessment as such. There's no, you can't take the sponginess and now start doing specific interventions. It's really to try and get an understanding of what is your city, how much is its blue, green, gray infrastructure percentages, what is your soil type, and how does it respond to this standard type of rainfall. A rainfall event of 50 millimeters is actually quite low, let's say within the Durban context, but in places like Egypt, 50 millimeters in a day is quite significant. So it will vary from city to city as to what the sponginess is. And with Terrain, so it's our machine learning tool that really, what I've mentioned is what question do you want to answer is what Terrain is. So in this case, we use Terrain to determine what is the land use coverage for these different areas. And on the right-hand side, you can see that this is it's the learning material that was input into the machine learning model. So we took small sample sizes of this 150 square kilometer area for each city, create the training material to say, okay, that's a road, that's a house, that's a tree, that's a roof, etc., etc. And then the machine learning pulls it all together to then run the full area to determine the land use coverage for that 150 square kilometers. In graphic terms, this won't help, here's the aerial imagery. So ideally from satellite imagery with the specific one that I have in the background here. This was from eThekwini Municipality's LiDAR data. So very high resolution information, put it through Terrain, generate these land use maps, and then from that you can convert that into blue, green, and gray infrastructure. In this specific snapshot, you actually can't see, I think you can maybe see a little bit of blue in this bottom left-hand corner, but a lot of it's the gray and the green. So as I mentioned earlier on, towards the end of 2021 and early last year, 2022, we did a global sponge city snapshots for 6 or 7 cities globally. That over the last 10, 12 months has grown to 10 cities globally and then 5 cities within Africa. The 10 cities that we've looked at globally are, you can read them on the screen, but you can see the sponginess chain varies from 18% all the way through to 35%, depending on the area. And these are all different climates, different locations. They have different soil types, different blue, green, gray infrastructure, and the like. This is an additional breakdown of when we ranked the cities in terms of their sponginess. Auckland came out first, and down to Sydney came out last in terms of its sponginess. What's interesting is that you can then also see the blue-green or the blue-green percentages seem to also correspond to that. Nairobi has a higher blue-green area than Auckland, but that's because of the soil. The soil type is less absorbent within Nairobi compared to Auckland. So it's quite interesting. This is kind of the spread that we had initially. Then leading up to COP27, which was in November last year, and it was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, we thought we would expand this global snapshot to include 5 or additional 4 African cities over and above the Nairobi snapshot. And the reason for this was because it was an African COP. We wanted to emphasize the importance of Africa, but then also compare it in a little bit more detail as to how does Africa compare to the rest of the world. So yeah, here's the snapshot results that we have for Africa. What's interesting, if you can remember from the previous slides, the range that we had was 18%, I think, to 35% of the 5 countries. If we ignore Nairobi, each city, so Cairo in the north, Durban in the south, Nairobi in the east, Kigali, Central/Eastern Africa, and Nigeria in the west, or Lagos in the west. The sponginess actually is quite a bit higher than the global cities, and that's mainly because of the blue and green blue-green infrastructure percentages for each of those cities. The next slide that we have is what these snapshots actually look like for the 4 cities, excluding Durban. So Cairo top left, Kigali top right, Nairobi bottom left, and Lagos bottom right. You can see that each of the cities, they have like semi-similar sponginess ratings besides Cairo, but the actual terrain and what it looks like is a lot different, and it varies from city to city. So it gives quite an interesting initial screening and an understanding of what does the city actually look like. We can look in Google Earth and see what things look like, and it depends on what time of year you actually flip through and how good the imagery is. But this actually helps trying to translate it into a little bit more useful information and generate discussions around why does sponginess matter? Should we be looking at nature-based solutions for flood risk mitigation measures within our catchments rather than conventional grey infrastructure? The Durban snapshot, because I wanted to keep this slide as a single slide on its own so that we can, I'd assume most of us are semi-familiar with where Durban is, but this kind of gives the extent of Durban with the harbour. The southern area goes down to the south. The west, I think, is near the bottom end of Westville, and then the north was just past Durban North. So 150 square kilometers is actually quite large. You can see the Ngani River coming through. The pink areas are buildings. And what we also did, so that's the CBD where we could pick up those pink buildings. What we also picked up, because of Africa being a lot different to global cities, or African cities being a lot different to global cities, what we found was that it was important that we kind of separate the African cities results from the global results, because we didn't want to necessarily compare the ratings of African cities to the global cities and think, oh, African cities are a lot better in terms of its sponginess or its blue-green infrastructure, therefore no investment or effort is required within Africa. We know that that's not the case. Many people die yearly due to floods, and there's always a loss in biodiversity and environmental degradation because of development, climate change, pollution, etc. And in addition to that, we know that within African cities there are informal settlements, and it's quite hard to tell, but there are little clusters of informal settlements within this snapshot. And what is actually quite interesting is, even though we provided the machine learning tool with these small pieces of information of what an informal settlement looks like from aerial imagery, it's the machine learning actually picked up the trends of what it needed to look for. The percentage of this 150 square kilometer that the informal settlements took up was very small in terms of area. We do understand that informal settlements have a high population or are very dense compared to other areas. So it doesn't mean that there's no priority with them in terms of the area that they cover. It just means that they are the most vulnerable and are located in areas which are more susceptible to flooding than other areas, and therefore there will be more people impacted by floods when they do happen. What did we do with this information? So COP was last year, November. We're releasing these different results for the different African cities, or the cities across Africa. we have an office, the Arab has an office in Durban as well as in Lagos, and I think 5 or 6 other offices across the continent. We then thought, because so COP27 was quite it's not everybody could go to it. So what we wanted to do was almost bring COP back home, and we hold workshops linking to these Sponge City snapshots. So we held a workshop within our Durban office, invited different people within the Durban community. That is not just engineers. I think we, as Arab, we were hosting it. We were the only, I think if I remember correctly, the only engineers in the room, but then we invited or private consultants in the room, but then invited eThekwini municipality, different departments from them, architects that we've worked with, master planning people, town planners, landscape architects, so quite a diverse range of people within the Durban community, and similar was done within our Lagos office. The Durban workshop, what we decided was we did a bit of an overview of where we are, where we come from, what COP27 is, what our approach to it is, and why we're actually having this specific workshop. And you can see it's quite an open plan type of style workshop, not a presentation and everybody sits and takes notes. So it's a bit of presentation, but then also a lot of interaction where we break people into 3 different groups, mixed up the participants. And what we said was, okay, here's 3 catchments. So we got an area in Durban North, I think it's, could be wrong, but it's River Horse Valley area. Central-ish Durban, which was Sydenham, and then Chesterville in the western parts of the snapshot. And each of them had their own unique characteristics. So we took each catchments of these areas and we said, right, here, you three groups, you each get 1 catchment, and you now we'll give you the information as to what your blue, green, and grey percentages are, what your sponginess is, what the soils are, and we'd like you to try and, based on that information, this initial quick understanding of your catchment, what could you do based on your local knowledge of the area to try and benefit the community, but also reduce the impacts of flooding within the catchment and downstream. There wasn't any modeling or designs done. It was just really a brainstorming, talking session of all these people from different diverse backgrounds as to what can be done from their context for that specific catchment. And this slide shows the 3 different areas. So the percentages range, even though Durban, I think, was 43% sponginess, you had a variation of, like, Sydenham was 32%, Durban North 40%, and Chesterville 43%. And then you could actually see how the green, grey, and blue percentages varied across those 3 catchments. It was actually quite interesting on the different types of interventions that were mentioned within the Durban North area. There was talk about implementing certain flood reduction measures upstream within the residential areas to try and protect the industrial areas in the downstream areas. With Sydenham, there was talks about this being a main transport corridor route from north to south through the catchment, and trying to do some sort of rainwater harvesting within the area. It was quite an interesting idea of doing rainwater harvesting to reduce flood peaks, but then also because it is a large transport route, use that rainwater for car washes, and the actual specific reference was with the washing of taxis within these areas. Chesterville, the combination of there's a little bit of informal settlement pockets in lower income areas to the eastern side, if I remember correctly, but the idea was to try and create almost like a triangle of biodiversity rich areas that connect. So like I can't remember the word exactly, but there was some triangle biodiversity connection, and doing some litter removal, solid waste management to try and improve the river that falls within this catchment. The interventions that we'd mentioned to the teams were based on the World Bank nature-based solutions catalog. So what it is really these different types of nature-based solutions. So I've mentioned earlier on, and I probably didn't explain exactly what they are, what nature-based solutions are, but it's kind of green, in humans' terms, green things, natural things that can be implemented within catchments to try and reduce the impact of flooding downstream, while also having multiple benefits of doing this in the same time. So some examples that we might be familiar of is like open green spaces, maybe natural inland wetlands, bioretention areas, river floodplains. Just trying to see how those different things can be implemented within each of these pockets, catchments, without doing any scientific or engineering calculations of whether it can work, but saying this is your suite of options. Here's a blank canvas. How can you try and implement these in? And then almost to come up with a master plan that in the end you can try and implement and test the system out for those these different interventions. What's actually quite nice about this catalog of nature-based solutions that the World Bank has is that it focuses on protecting what you have currently, then going to enhancing what you have, and only then after the protection and enhancement is you create new NBS. So if there is current nature-based solutions which are just coincidental within your catchment, keep that going, enhance it, and then if that still isn't enough, go for adding on new nature-based solutions. What the information within that catalog has is actually splits it up quite nicely into the type of city that you have. So coastal, a delta, a river, and a mountainous area, the scale at which these interventions can be applied, the approach, so that protect, rehabilitate, and create, and then the different processes that these interventions can benefit or add to. My screen's a little bit small here. Okay, there, that's better. If you think of it, if its primary purpose is, let's say, to reduce flood impacts downstream, you also get a benefit of, let's say, with an inland wetland, of water collection, aquifer recharge, there's infiltration, there's a cooling effect within the local areas. There's all these additional things rather than just putting in, let's say, a larger culvert to try and deal with the flooding issue. Now, the last slide is, what does this mean for Africa and what does it mean for us in terms of the sponge city results? The purpose of it was to generate discussions, and I really am hoping, I do expect that there will be quite a few questions to understand, following on from this presentation, as to what next, what does this mean? And that's the whole purpose of these sponge city snapshots, is to generate discussions. I'm completely fine if people disagree with the approach, with the results. It's really to get people to start thinking about it and speaking about it and taking it forward. The key messages that I find that we have for Africa is that with those previous slides, I know so we shouldn't necessarily compare to other global cities, but if we did have to compare, the blue-green assets are significant. We've got a high percentage of that within our cities in Africa compared to fully developed countries, and I think we need to try and preserve those as much as possible while still allowing development to happen. It's going to take a collective effort. It's not just, I know this is a SAICE talk, but it's not just civil engineers that are involved in this. It's other engineering disciplines, planners, architects, social science, environmentalists. It's a collaborative approach, and yeah, we're going to need innovative approaches given the constraints, and I've included this as we should include digital in terms of these innovative approaches. So we need these innovative approaches because we know that within Africa, we are constrained with budgets from a local municipality level, as well as the clients that we work for, potentially within the private sector. That finances are tricky, and we need to try and come up with clever ways that there is some sort of circular economy within this that has multiple benefits. And yeah, my last thing is just think beyond the work that you do. It's not just this little small box that you work in. your site could fit within, as an example, one of these areas here. How does it fit within the catchment? What happens upstream? What happens downstream? Is there some sort of connectedness that could happen from your site with surrounding areas? Yeah, that's really it for me.
Right. Thank you for that, Matthew. That was a quick presentation. We do have a couple of questions in the chat section, so I'll read them out and then you can attempt to answer them. The first question is from Craig. He says, how does your sponginess findings correspond to the water sensitive index, like the one done by Zutari?
Cool. So we, in terms of the water sensitive index, that work, as far as I understand, didn't deal with Durban specifically. It was more Cape Town, city of Johannesburg, and I think Nelson Mandela Bay. But this type of, in terms of sponge, so there is no real correlation because it's different areas. But I'd say it speaks to a similar type of thing of the sponginess can be used within a water sensitive city type of approach, because it's all, in broader sense, like green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, sponge cities, sustainable urban drainage systems, water-sensitive urban design, all kind of speak to the same thing of trying to do things better, going greener, acknowledging that water could be a resource rather than a hazard. And I think that should be just gotten rid of quite quickly. Craig, I don't know if that answered your question. You can maybe just respond in the chat.
Yeah. Second question is from Diani. How is the sponginess of an area different from the infiltration capacity of a catchment?
Cool. Okay, so if I understand that correctly, so it's sponginess of an area different from infiltration. Okay, so the sponginess, if we take, there are three variables. There's rainfall, soil, and blue, green, gray infrastructure. If we take rainfall out of it, because that was a standard 50 mils per day across for all the cities, if we take that out, because that's in essence a constant, if we look at the infiltration and the blue, green, gray infrastructure, the infiltration things will really speak to the greener parts of the thing. So your driving aspect in terms of that with infiltration is on the blue and green, or blue, green, and gray. Yeah, so there is some sort of similarity, but even if we look at the one example that I did give was for Nairobi, the sponginess was less than, I think it was Auckland. However, the blue-green infrastructure was slightly better. So which means the soil was slightly less absorbent, or had less infiltration capacity.
All right. I think this one is a comment from Craig again. It says it'd be interesting to know if the LiDAR resolution in your assessment is the same. I have used semi-automatic land use classification tool on QGIS to improve the land use map for a model, but I had to train the AI. What I found is that the tool, which operates much like terrain, is heavily relies on the resolution raster data. So if your sponginess index, if you were to make a comparison, it has to be from the same resolution. And the resolution has to be very fine for areas with mixed land use. Otherwise, the AI attributes land uses based on the pixel density.
Cool, got you. So in terms of that aerial imagery, that satellite imagery, it's a standard source that we used. So the same resolution across all the cities except for Durban. And the reason for that was, I thought that if we, within Durban, within the municipality, if we have, I know that we have higher resolution imagery, why not use it? See what the benefit is, and sorry, not a benefit, but if you've got better resolution data, it makes sense to use it. Yeah.
Okay. A question from Trevor Duncan. Does the sponginess model analysis take ground slopes into consideration? If not, why?
Cool. So no, it doesn't. It is purely let's say I'm going to say, like in simple terms, a pixel-based approach. So for this specific area, rain lands on it. Does it have any infiltration? Yes, no. Well, when I mean yes, no, it will classify what that infiltration is based on what the land use is and that soil type. But it's not a hydrological model that would go from this cell to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, and pull it all together. So the main thing is that it's there. The results can be used for that. The land use classification can be used for that within a hydrological or a hydraulic model. The one I'm thinking of is specifically as PC Swim. It can be used as an input data set for that. But yeah, it doesn't take into account ground slopes. Why is the main thing wasn't it? The purpose of the analysis isn't to try and come up with answers for any city around the world. There's multiple things that need to be taken into account here, like specifically the local rainfall. Also the pipe network, the culvert capacity. Do the bridges have the capacity, and well, culverts have the capacity for a specific recurrence interval? And the main purpose of it is to try and create a uniform approach to determine the sponginess, and then take those discussions forward and have a bit of a better understanding of what is my actual city comprised of, and can we try and identify different areas that we can try and do more, or start to do these discussions on what modeling is needed, what interventions, does it seem to make sense, what is the impact of ground slopes within it. Yeah.
All right. Well, the presentation was
Sorry, I just see Craig did a reply in terms of Australia and other countries. Yeah, so I haven't actually compared the water sensitives index to the sponginess of this. If I remember correctly, the water sensitive index doesn't just take into account the land use. It's multiple things. There's governance, there's how people actually use water, so physically, like for drinking, as well as recreational activities. How do people prioritize nature and environment over development, etc., etc. Yeah, I hear what you're saying there, Craig, in terms of the findings, because it does that 18% for Sydney does seem to contrast what they are in terms of the water sensitive city. But why is that? That's what would need to be explored. Like, I'm not saying that this is the answer, this is the correct thing, but it's to generate these discussions and say, okay, if it is 18%, maybe that 18% of sponginess is actually located in the right areas. Whereas for Durban, like we had that severe flooding, we've got a lot of blue-green areas, quite spongy, but there was still a lot of damage and loss of life. So it begs the question of why is there those issues?
Right. Matthew, just on your presentation, one of the slides, you mentioned what sponginess and what the blue, green, and gray data is. I'm just wondering if you can expand on how you measure sponginess from that.
Okay, so it's when you take your it's that equation of rain. So almost like a water balance equation of you have your 50 mils of rain that lands on a specific land use. What is that land use's ability to absorb that rainfall? Let's say if it's a roof, there would be, or a building that 50 mils of rainfall lands on, it has only there's some depression storage, so some of the voids within that roof area. but the rest ends up going as runoff. So it wouldn't have any actual infiltration. But then if you compare to a green area or a grassed area, the 50 mils will land, it will have ability to absorb some of that water or that rainfall, and then a smaller percentage would run off, would go out the system compared to the building. If you take a water or a blue piece of infrastructure, which is like a river or lake or a dam, the 50 mils lands on that, it stays in there. So it's got 100% sponginess. I don't know if that answers your question, Karabo.
Yeah, it does. The other question I have, I was just wondering, in terms of government involvement, how open are they to having this as policy when you look at urban planning in municipal regions at municipal level?
So just say that first part again.
So in terms of involvement of government and the idea of sponge cities and translating it into policy, how involved are they in terms of urban planning and spatial developments?
And I can't comment specifically on that because I haven't worked in governments and within that spatial planning aspect. But with the workshops that we had, with the workshop that we had in Durban, there were members from the there were town planners from the municipality that were in the land use teams. They were quite interested in this in terms of, I wouldn't say like taking this approach and embracing it, but taking the thinking behind it of it's important to try and preserve the natural environment as much as possible. And I think a lot of times that they get applications for development within green zones, and the developer just wants to flatten it, completely harden the whole area. And from their side, they need to try and have something extra that can steer the developer in a specific direction of saying, yes, it is a green zone, maybe you own the land, but this does have a specific importance within the broader system. Yeah, so yeah, I can't see that necessarily the local authorities would be saying, oh, we want to be a sponge city and take this and that's what it needs to be. But in terms of the thinking behind it of incorporating nature-based solutions, preserving the natural assets, I think they're on board with that.
Okay, there's a question from Tom, which says, is sponginess not a different way of expressing the runoff coefficient in the rationale formula? Or how do they compare?
Yeah.
Probably.
I'm just trying to think. It possibly is similar to that, but so it could be similar. What's a little bit different is that it's just the approach that's been taken of using machine learning to generate these land use maps. That's really, I think, quite I don't know, personally I'd say it's quite an innovative way of doing it, because normally we would, or at least what I've done previously, is you get a land use shapefile from the local authority, and that's what you would use generally as your land use map for your flood models. Where this is taking imagery and taking and saying this is what's actually going on in the catchment. So yes, potentially a way it is similar to the run of the C value in the rational method, but in terms of a graphical way of representing it, sorry, not graphical. Graphical way of representing it. I think it's a bit better than saying the C value for Durban is 0.3.
All right, another question from Trevor Duncan. Says, my only concern is that slope typically has a marked impact on area's ability to be spongy. I would think because if there's no time for an area to absorb water due to rapid runoff from steep slopes, it would seem at least partly irrelevant as what the land use is and what would skew the index figure.
Yeah, completely agree. And this is not a like, or I should maybe said earlier on, it's not a solution of this is what the thing is, but it starts to generate these discussions, thinking what are the other things that are actually important. Yes, slope. I think one of the very key things is what is the below ground infrastructure. So the stormwater pipes, the catch pits, the culverts, the bridge crossings, do they have capacity? Yeah. So how do designers, sorry, I'm just going to read Tom's, unless there's someone had their hand up.
No, not yet.
Oh, okay.
I can read Tom's question for you. So how do designers find solutions using the sponginess rather than installing infrastructure?
So this would be understanding the catchment that you work within, or that say your site is located in, or that the catchment that you're trying to focus on, and you have a bit more of a better understanding of what is hardened areas. How can you maybe retrofit? Let's say 20% of your catchment is roads, and another 15 or 20% is buildings. You've got about 35 to 40% just on hard infrastructure, and that would contribute to a lot of the runoff in principle. These are ways that you can try and target those specific land uses to become a bit softer rather than hard concrete and asphalt that just generates a lot of runoff. Yeah, it helps with looking at within your catchment, what are the areas that you could try and prioritize specific type of interventions. Similar to with the other, those 3 catchments that we looked at for Durban during the workshop, was each of them were definitely different. And they would need different approaches to try and implement, I guess, flood mitigation as well as nature-based solutions.
Okay, I've got another question. So in terms of, I don't know if this is a stupid question, but in terms of like urban planning, when you are reconfiguring an area, right? So I'm just thinking, if you have infrastructure in place and you are re-looking at changing the urban planning or dynamics of the city, how does existing infrastructure affect your sponginess that you're going to predict in the future or in the new arrangement? I don't know if that makes sense.
So you're saying, sorry, try and repeat that. I think I might have got it.
So if you've got, for example, if I can ask it in a more like what we do in structures, right? So if you have a building, and then you repurpose the building, right? There's certain things that you look at. So if you've got an area which is existing with all your roads networks and so on, if you then change the urban arrangement of the area for repurposing, how is that? What do you look for when you consider sponge cities, and how does the existing affect what is going to be coming onto that?
You mean like if you're looking from top down, would you see something different? Yeah. So from like a bird's eye view, would you see something different? So green areas might become hardened areas might become green. Is that what you mean? Yes. Yeah, so then that would impact, so let's say, the sponginess, but it's based on a snapshot of a point in time. So the Durban one specifically, we had that aerial imagery from City. I think it was around about 2020 is when the imagery was. So that snapshot is for that specific point in time. If there was another piece of aerial imagery that would be available, we could apply the same set, let's say that's dated 2020 or 2022. We could then apply the same method and see how does the sponginess vary and where are these changes coming from. Yeah.
Okay. Another question is from Shanae. How did the specific 150 square kilometers area, how was that chosen rather than something larger or smaller Was it a software constraint that you had?
I don't think it was necessarily a software constraint. I could be wrong on that, but it was because it's Sponge City. The emphasis there was on city. So how like spongy is your city? If we're starting to increase it beyond, say, a thumb suck of 150 square kilometers, you might be ending up in non-city areas. It obviously varies from city to city, but so we did to try and keep the approach uniform. We then determined we set the limits as at 150 square kilometers. You could apply it at a catchment level, but that like for example within the Durban area, yes, we had the Mgani River coming through. Catchment area goes, it's several hundred kilometers upstream. It's like so we could have done it as a catchment way, but then the area is quite a lot larger. We just try to focus on the city and what would capture that city.
Right. Another question from Vendant. Are gabions and Reno mattresses a good intermediary to prevent erosion and protecting the water course when transitioning from a urban piped stormwater system and rehabilitating the flow for release into a natural flowing stream or waterway? Would this suggestion be considered channelizing the water course? I think it's a general question, not necessarily for Sponge City.
That's fine. I'll answer it. I do prefer gabions and Reno mattresses over concrete channels. There's a bit more of a like semi-natural type of thing. They are quite flexible in terms of if there is some sort of erosion or external factor that does happen, it will mold to, or generally Reno mattresses will mold to suit the shape that ends up coming through. I don't know if I can actually, it seems like it's a general question, but it's specific to a specific project. I don't know if it's in terms of channelizing the water course. I don't know if that's leading on to a query in terms of does it trigger a water use license. So I don't know if that would be considered channelizing the water course. Yeah.
There's another question from Tom, which also might be general. Many of the issues related to the April 2022 floods were due to permanent drainage infrastructure not being placed and temporary works being unable to handle the peak flood. What is your comment on that?
Tom, can you maybe just elaborate on that? What do you mean by permanent infrastructure, drainage infrastructure not being in place, and then temporary works unable to handle the peak?
Yeah, so I'm talking Umhloti in particular. There is a very large shopping centre, and I don't want to get held up and be sued, being developed, and they had obviously the designers put various retention ponds, upsizing of pipes and all sorts of other things in place, but that was going to be done by the contractor later in their program. They were looking for leasable square meterage, with the net result that when it did rain like it did, the people who live on the nice scenic, slightly river banks and looking at the sea ended up being in the sea, and that is what I'm referring to.
Okay.
I'm not saying they're to blame, but
yes, yeah. I thought it might be something leading to that. I think, okay, that is a tricky one with like during construction, if there's a flood, who's responsible, what needs to be in place. I don't know, to be honest. I'm not too contractually savvy on that side of things with it. But I think what we need to, in general, what we need to remember is that, as with most things, it's within engineering, it has a specific design life. It has specific to floods and stormwater, it's got a recurrence interval that we design for. If that recurrence interval is exceeded, so it's designed for a 5-year storm. If a 20-year storm comes through, that 5-year storm, or that culvert or pipe or infrastructure size for a 5-year is going to be, it won't have sufficient capacity. So it's part of the thing. If we could design for very large 1 in 1,000 year events, but when a 1 in 5,000 year event comes, stuff's still going to fail. So there's that like cost benefit of what is the correct recurrence interval that should be designed for. What I would say is that things that we should maybe look at with the work that we do is don't assume that our pipes and culverts and grass channels and rivers and that are clean. There will be silt, there will be litter, there will be blockages. It's doing those type of sensitivity tests of what if X, Y, Z had to happen, what would be the impact? And yeah, and maybe this comment about like saying there's stormwater pond and pipes and that. If I'm not saying that sponginess would solve that at all, but just the thinking of how does your site fit within that catchment upstream, downstream, and what are the impacts of that? So generally when we do, I mean, I'm saying we in a broad sense as civil structural engineers, we'll ask for a survey of the property boundary plus maybe, I don't know, a 1 meter buffer, 2 meter buffer. But is that actually sufficient? Do we not need to look a bit more broader than that? I think a lot of the times we just focus on our property boundary and we assume that when we're doing our rational method calcs, that's the catchment area that we're focusing on. More often than not, there's external flows coming through our site. Strategically chose not to answer that directly, Tom, if that's okay, but
no, I don't want you to go to jail for what you say, so I accept it. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. And what I have heard though is with the Durban floods, they were in the order of, in some areas, the 1 in 200 year event. So the floods, the rainfall events were significant, depending on which area you were located in.
Right, Matthew, I think there's a last question from my side that I want to ask. So part of the 3 main facets of sponge cities is restoration measures in your cities, right? So if you look at a city like a developed city like Johannesburg, for example, how would you go about restoration in that in a small area which is quite densely developed?
Okay.
How do you make it more spongy? I think that's the question.
Okay, cool. So what I would do is try and understand what is like, so I would refer to it as almost like that catchment, that the area that you're wanting to restore or rehabilitate. Model that catchment from hydrology and hydraulic modeling of a status quo currently, what's going on, what would we like it to be, so bring in let's call it all the greenies, environmentalists, ecologists and such, bring them in, landscape architects, for different types of people, and say, how can we envision like what this catchment should be, and how can we try and piece these different areas together from maybe green corridors, and then with that is there ways to retrofit existing, like you're saying it's quite a built-up area, to retrofit those to become a bit greener and softer, or more spongy, and then if needed, if there are like so it's those like buildings, but then also the roadways, do you actually need a 2x2 road, or can you drop that to a 1+1, and the other half of the road is a nice cycling path or lane that has quite a lot of vegetation, rain gardens, infiltration trenches. So to try and incorporate the green stuff within the hardened areas, it does require a lot of retrofit. It's not just putting in a JoJo tank and you'll sort everything out. Yeah, but I'd say modeling it to make informed decisions as what's the point of it? What are you wanting to do? You can even include some sort of economics of if you spend a certain amount of money to reduce the flood peak by a certain amount, what would be the financial benefit or the benefit of not having flooding downstream? So you can start doing that, of doing some financial metrics and modeling of that there is maybe a kind of like a return on investment with the money that is put in, of damages that don't then happen in future. Yeah.
All right. If there are no questions, I think we can probably end it here.
There's another question, Karaba.
Another question from Bali. What is the relationship of sponginess and stormwater drainage? Do they somehow work hand in hand?
I assume Mbali is meaning stormwater drainage as like the stormwater network, the underground pipe. So while I have been, let's say, advocating a lot for nature-based solutions and going green and retrofitting things, I personally do think that it's a balancing act between the green and the gray. So having nature-based solutions, but also there is, especially within like a lot of the South African context, we do have these ridiculously high intensity storm events that nature can't actually deal with if we had to not allow nature to do what it needed to do in terms of flood lines and where the river should normally go. So I do think there is a reason why we should have some sort of grey infrastructure, so pipes and culverts and concrete canals. But I think we should rather explore the green aspects first before we go straight to a grey solution. So it's that, balancing act.
All right. Thanks, Matthew. I think done quite a lot of questions here. And if there are no questions, we can probably end it here. There are a couple of announcements that Tom has posted on the chat section. One of which is the global launch of the Maselu Lekane, which is going to be held at the South African House High Commission in Trafalgar Square in London. Tom has posted the link if you want to attend virtually. There's also a link there for the April webinar, which is going to be the last Thursday of the month. If you guys could please register there.
It'll be on the 20th, Karaba, because of public holidays, so 20th.
Yes,
and it's
20th.
on a bulk water project done by MSW. So those people who don't like stormwater problems can deal with potable water problem.
All right. Yeah, thanks for that, Tom. The webinar is on the 20th, not the last Thursday of the month. Just as a vote of thanks to Tom and those who organized the webinar. Big thank you to Matthew and Arab for allowing time and sharing the work that they've done and the presentations that they've done around the world. Most of all, thank you to the delegates who spent time to attend the webinar. If you need TPD points for this webinar, please stick around for the next 12 minutes, I think, for the sponsors' slides, as well as Tom's slides.
Right, thanks everybody. Matthew, thank you very much for putting the effort in to prepare the presentation. You need to talk a bit slower so that you can make things last for longer, but when you don't do this for a living, you get used to making things go. You obviously, time is money, so you do things as quickly as possible, but no problem. It was very, very entertaining and informative. Karaba, as always, thank you for facilitating, and again, thanks to our sponsors for this evening's event, and I concur. Thank you to Arab for giving up Matthew's time and for bringing this information to everybody. The last message for all our students in the room is make sure when you're thinking about your drainage or your solutions, design solutions, don't just put in the big infrastructure without realizing you are changing nature's normal habits, and there are potential consequences, and try to find as green a solution as you can. I'm